Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Solomon Jeremiah. Today I will be showing you how you can assign roles in Azure. Right now I'm logged into Azure and I can see that I have a lot of resources in my cloud platform. We're looking at how we can manage access to these resources that we have in our cloud environment. The Azure role-based access control helps us manage who has access to Azure resources, what they can do with those resources, and what areas they have access to. The Azure role-based access control is an authorization system that is built on the Azure Resource Manager. What this does for us is that it provides a fine-grained access management to Azure resources. So now we already understand what the Azure role-based access control is all about. But then, when we are talking about roles in Azure, we need to understand what role assignment is all about. In Azure, we have role assignments. And when we are talking of role assignments in Azure, we are going to be looking at three elements. The first is the security principal. The second is the role definition, and the last is the scope. Now, role assignments enable us to grant, access to a principal. And when we're talking about principal, this is a user, a group, a service principal, or a managed identity. Now, this falls under the security principle among the three elements I mentioned earlier. We need to assign a role. Who do we assign the role to? We're assigning the role to a principal, and the principal can be a user, group, service principal, or a managed identity. Now that we understand this, we are going to talk about the role definition. The role definition is a collection of different permissions, and what this is actually telling us is the action that this principal can perform when we've assigned them a particular role. So it's just giving us the collection of all. It's just basically a collection of different permissions, and this collection is referred to as a role. Then we have the scope. Now, when we're talking about the scope represents a resource or a set of resources that the principal is allowed to access. Now, we can choose to scope our role assignment to a single resource in Azure, a resource group, a subscription, or a management group. If you're familiar with Azure hierarchy, you would know that we have the management group at the top, then we have the subscription, we have the resource group, then we have the resource itself. So what this means is, if we have a particular role and we choose to assign the role, we choose to apply the role at the management group, the user that we would be assigning that role to at that particular scope would have access to all the subscription, the resource group, and the resource under the management group. So we need to actually understand what we want to achieve, the use case, before we go ahead with assigning role in Azure. Now let me look at the portal and see what I can do here. So right now I'm in my Azure portal and I have a user account here, and if I refresh the user account, I'll see that this is a user called Joe, and by the time I click on resource group, we'll see that Joe does not have access to any resource right now in my Azure portal. The other user I have here is Paul, and if I do the same, there is no resource here for Paul. And let me just click on virtual network. There's nothing here. So right now, I'll go back to my Azure portal. And when I come to my Azure portal, I'm looking at assigning a role to both users. So what I would do is one of the user, the scope is going to be on the resource group, while the other user, the scope is going to be directly on the resource itself, which is the virtual network. I'll pick one of the virtual network. Now let's start with the resource group. When I come to the resource group, I can see that I have two virtual network, and I can see that by the left there is this access control. So what I can do once I click here is I can go to add, and then I'll select add role assignment. Once I come to role assignment, you will see I have two tabs right here under the role. I have the job function roles, and then I have the privilege administrator roles. For the job function role, let's just say we have like an engineer, and we don't really want to give the engineer a lot of, permissions. So we just need access to maybe restarting a virtual machine, creating a virtual machine. We can choose to pick a job function role for that particular task that we want the engineer to perform. But if we look at this other tab here, we have the administrative role. This is something you have to be cautious about. Now, if you look at this, we have a caution icon here telling you, can a job function role with less access be used instead? So why this is actually placing this caution here is when you assign any of this role to a user, you're actually granting the user a privileged administrator access. And what this means is that the user would have the ability to manage Azure resources or assign roles to other users. So you have to know if this is actually what you want to give the user. So I'm not going to be giving the user this role right now, but what I just want to do is I just want us to see what we have, the details in this role. So if I click on the details, you're going to see that we have the permissions. And if you look at this permission, you can see this is a lot. And that's because of this particular role that I selected, the owner role. But when we go to JSON, we'll have we can see this clearly. Looking at this, you would see that we have the role name, we have the description, we have the assignable scope, we have the permissions, and under the permissions, we have all of these. Now, when we are looking at the scope, this is the root scope. It means that this particular role is available to be assigned at the root level and also subscription level, the resource group level. That's basically what this actually means. So when you're creating a custom role, you can choose to create a custom role at the root level, or you can choose to say, okay, I'm creating this custom role for a particular subscription. So we can choose to do that as well. Now, when we come down to where we have the permissions, we would see that we have the action, and then we have this wildcard, which is the asterisk. So what this simply means is that this particular role, when it is assigned to a principal, that principal will have all the permissions. So that means when they want to carry out actions, they have the permission to carry out all the permissions. That's what this means. So we have not actions, we have data actions, and we have not data actions. I would be explaining this with the next role, which is the contributor. Now let's look at this let's view the details. I'm coming back to JSON. Now when we look at JSON, we'll notice that for this particular role, for not actions, we have some permissions here. So what this simply means is that this user can perform all of the permissions except for these permissions. These permissions are excluded. If you look at this, you'll see that the numbers reduced compared to this other role. Now, when a principal is authenticating, what the Azure Resource Manager will be looking at is the effective role or effective permission that the principal have. And for it to do that, it will be minusing these actions from, it will be subtracting not actions from actions. So all permissions, excluding these permissions, is the effective permission for any principal that would be assigned the contributor role. That's exactly what this means. And if you also look at this, you can see that we have a user that we want to perform this, we want to give access to, and this is the number of permissions we want the user to have access to. Now, it is actually easier to, type what we don't want, because if we want to start listing all of the actions here, it's just going to be a lot. But since we know that the excluded permissions are less, it's easier for us to just type that and then use the asterisk. That's what is happening here. We also have the data actions. For the data actions, when you look at this is just we're thinking of, okay, do we want to give this user access to a particular storage? We can choose to use this, and not data action, we can choose to restrict their access. Now, when we look at this, why I am explaining this, the reason I'm explaining this is it will be very useful when you're creating your own custom role. This is going to help you because you'll be able to edit all of these the way you want it. You will also be able to, create your scope and all of it. So I'm going to close this. Now, the reason I'm closing this, I just want to open one of the job function roles that I'll be using. So this is what I want to be using for one of the users, and that is going to be the network contributor role. So let's view the details. So if we come here, you'll see that since the actions are not a lot, we can just put them here, and the not action, we don't really need to put anything here because it simply means that these are the only actions that this particular role, this particular a service principal will be able to perform when they are assigned this particular role. That's what this means. So I'm just going to close this. So what I would do is, let me just use this then. I'm already here. So I will just select the contributor role, network contributor. I'll go next. And then this is where we have the assign access to. So when we're looking at the assign access to, it's just simply us selecting the principal, which I mentioned earlier. One of the elements is we are looking at is the security principals, the security principal, I mean. So for the security principal, we have the user, we have the group, or the service principal. Then we also have the manage identity. So one thing I would also advise is if you can, learn about each of these is also great, like how to create users, how to create groups, how to create a service principal, how to also create a manage identity. And if you're also learning about this, you would also have to go down in terms of, for the manage identity, you probably want to learn about the system assigned and also the user assigned. And you're also trying to look at the life cycle of the role that you'll be assigning to the manage identity. So there are other stuffs you can as well learn from each of these security principal. Right now, I would not be going into all of those details. I just want to assign this to a user. So I would be assigning the user for this. So I'm just going to give for this. And oh, sorry, I spelled that wrongly. So this is going to be poll, and then I'm going to select poll. So Now I selected poll. I'm going to go next. Now you notice we have conditions here, but it's graded out and we moved over here. So when I'm assigning the next user a role, I will try to select a role where we can see the conditions, and that's going to be the privileged administrator role. So what I would do is I will come to the role, the assignment type. Now for the assignment type, you will see here we have intra privilege identity management. That's PIM. This is a topic on its own, but what this is actually telling us is that when we're assigning this user this role, we can choose to make the role eligible or active. Now what eligible does for us is that when we assign a user a role and we're using the assignment type eligible, the user would have that role, but anytime they want to use it, they have to go in and activate it for the period of time they'll be using that role. And when they are done, the role, is deactivated, but the role is still with them. And also we can also set a duration, right? For like we can also set a start time and date for that we want this particular role to be assigned to the principal. But for this, I'll keep this on active and then I'll leave it on permanent. So I'll go next, and when I go next, I will just review and that should be good to go for poll. So the next thing I want to do is I want to assign the other user, which is the Joe, the owner role for the virtual network. So I'm going to pick the headquarters virtual network, and then I will go to access control. I'll come here and then I will still go to role assignment. Now you'll see that the scope, right? I'm kind of limiting what that user can do in terms of, I know I'm giving him the owner role, but it's just going to apply to that resources. That's exactly what I'm doing. So I will come here now. I want to go with the privileged administrator role. I'm going to select the owner and then I'll go next. Now, I explained this earlier, so I'm going to click on the user, which is Joe. And once I click on Joe, I will select Joe, and then the next thing I would do for description is optional, but it's recommended you just put that. Maybe you want to, explain stuff better for other member of your team. So I'm going to go next, and when I come to conditions, you'll see that now what the condition is actually doing for us is just trying to give us an additional check. It's optional, right? Just for us to still fine-grain the access control that we'll be assigning to this particular principal. Now, if you look at these, we could see that the owner role has like the wildcard, a lot of permissions. But when we get to this condition, since we know that the privileged administrator access has the ability to assign roles to other user, we can choose to say, okay, since you have all of the permissions, we want to limit the user you can actually assign roles to. So you can see this, allow user to only assign selected roles to selected principals. So we can choose to, adjust this. We can as well choose to select this, but when we select this, that means this is highly privileged. So that's what this condition is all about. So if you come here, you will see that at this point, this is a pre-configured one. And if we come here, we can choose to add conditions. So if you look at the conditions, you can see we can still configure the conditions the way we want it. So I'll come back here and I will just go with this, and then I'll go next. And once I go with next, I will just go to review and assign. So what I've just done now, I've assigned the owner role, and when I did that, I assigned it at the resource itself, not the, okay, let me put it this way. So what I did was I assigned a role to a principal, and when we're looking at the scope is at the resource level. So I kind of reduce how much access that this user would have even when they were given like a privileged administrator role. So that's what I did to the user. And for the other user, I assigned the user a role which is the network contributor, but that's the scope was on the resource group. So if probably I create new network in that resource group, this user would still have access to all of those network that I will probably create. But for this other user that I gave the owner role, the only access that this user is going to be having would be on this particular virtual network. So if I create more virtual network in this resource group, this user would not have access to those virtual network. So let's just go to the user, the end user side, and let's see what it looks like. So if I come over to this part, let me pull this. So I'm going to pull. This is pull. I will just try to refresh. And when I refresh, I would click on resource group. So now you can see that when I go to the resource group, I can see the resource group. And when I open the resource group, this user can now access these VNets. So all the permissions that comes with the network contributor, this user is going to have access to those permissions and would be able to perform those tasks on this virtual network because they are in the resource group which the user have access to. Now let's go to the other user, which is Joe. So when I refresh Joe, let's see what Joe is going to see. So right now, Joe should just have access to the VNet. So if you look at this is the virtual network. Joe has access to the virtual network. But if I try to click on the resource group, you can see that Joe does not have access on the resource group. So what I just did in summary was showing you how you can assign roles in Azure. Now we also have role assignments in Entra, Microsoft Entra, which is something I should be, creating another video on. I have had communication with a few people. I see sometimes they tend to mix those two roles together, but yes, those roles are different. The Azure roles are just specific for the resources in your Azure cloud, while the Entra, you're dealing with resources that has to do with Entra, like probably you're creating user and other administrative tasks. But then we also have this connection where you have a global admin, and the global admin can actually give themselves access to all the resources in Azure, and then they can assign roles to other users or principal in Azure. So today I will be stopping here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will try to make another video, and the next video should be Entra roles. Bye.